Welcome, Daniel, with a good morning. Happy Memorial Day. Indeed, it is a beautiful Memorial Day. The weather where I am is excellent. It is great. Good morning, David. Hope you're doing well. Hope it's nice there. Hope you got a nice day planned, all kinds of stuff to do. I'm in Canada, so it's not exactly a holiday, but there are a lot of Americans here. I was thinking about going down to the States today for it, but busy. It also happens to be my wife's official birthday today, so we've got some stuff planned. Didn't really want to run around. She had her family visiting this weekend. It was great. We had a nice time. Sorry about the show Saturday. I did intend to do it, but I had to wake people up. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to do it. The sun was up as it is today. Everyone, let me just confirm. We have a sunrise. We've got a Bitcoin running. All that's left for us to do is have a coffee and talk about what's new. That was the end of that cup, but it was an excellent cup. It was great. As you know, we like to start every morning off with the fakest news we can find. I got some good stuff here. So John Kerry, we've heard a lot of news about farming and in England, they're going to create the thing for the farts and the burps, right? They're going to capture the farts and the burps of the cows because Greta's not happy about it, guys. Can't have those cows farting and burping. But now it looks like it's coming to America, right? So it turns out John Kerry says farmers must stop growing food to meet net zero goals for emissions. So food, not necessary, I guess. Thank you, John Kerry. And it's indeed finding its way to Northern Ireland, right? So Northern Ireland having trouble. Northern Ireland faces a loss of 1 million sheep and cattle in order to meet its climate targets. This is from The Guardian. Northern Ireland's Assembly's first climate act will require the farming sector to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So sheep, see ya. Now it might be good. I mean, you're hearing about all this food stuff. We're not going to have as much food, right? Well, it might prevent some discrimination, okay? And remember, we never fat shame on this show, but this is what Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, says. So there's going to be less food, but maybe, according to Eric Adams, weight discrimination. He just signed a weight discrimination bill into law that says that body type is not connected to health. They're not connected, guys. Your health is not related to your body type. And it will be even less connected once there's less food, right? So that's what's happening. And finally, MSNBC, because we like the mind reading Moscow time, right? Moscow time is really at its peak when they do some really great mind reading, when they reveal their mind reading skills. So MSNBC has this. If Elon Musk wants to facilitate Twitter as a digital public square, he can't also structure it around his emotional validation and maximizing his personal profit. It's called the tyranny of King Elon. So there's a tyranny, I guess, Elon doing that, right? We're doing all that stuff. Let's see what the morning folks have to say. I don't have any peanuts for the Blue Jays. Is Johnny Rico out? What's going on? Yeah, beautiful. Today is a beautiful day in Montreal, P-Man. You are correct. It is absolutely gorgeous. A little hot yesterday. I took the kids around for a nice walk. Good morning. Going to be grilling day down the bayou, South Louisiana. Oh, is that so, Joseph? I have a night. I think I've told you on this show that I am seeking to make a religious pilgrimage to Avery Island, which is not far from you in South Louisiana, because I am the world's largest Tabasco fan. And if you guys didn't know the history of Tabasco, it's pretty amazing. It's one family who's owned it for 5-6 generations now, and no one knows how much money they make. No one knows what their profits are. They've never taken They've never taken any investments, and you can go there and you can eat all their delicious food, and they have, oysters and all kinds of stuff, and you can have it with Tabasco. Tabasco is like a real budget item in my life. Like I probably spend $50 to $100 a month on hot sauces, most of which is Tabasco. I order it right from Avery Island regularly because there's a little bit of a savings if you get it by the gallon. I can buy Tabasco by the gallon. No kidding. My kids think it's hilarious. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, though. I'm an absolute addict. So I am envious of grilling down in the bayou in South Louisiana, Joseph. I'm a big fan of the food down there. Now you know. Now you know. Johnny says, beautiful day in Maine. Yeah, I do. My mom was supposed to go to Maine this week before the big prices set in. It gets expensive for lots of folks. I was a regular Maine vacationer in my life. It's only about 4 hours from my farm, so we make it there as often as we can because it's beautiful. So you remember the last Moscow Time that I read? I'll read it again because it is the lead to the next story that we're going to be talking about. So this is the one where MSNBC says if Elon Musk wants to facilitate Twitter as a digital public square, he can't also structure it around his emotional validation and maximizing his personal profits, right? He can't do that. That contrasts well with what we all know here, that already Twitter, just having Elon in place, has completely already changed the world because he's provided this public square. And we've had finally some form of release, some form of pressure valve on all of the gaslighting and all of the lying and the debating and the arguing and the fighting and the anxiety and all those things. So we finally now have this medium where you're able to have conversations. And indeed, so much has changed in the few months now that Elon Musk has owned it. And Balaji brings it up here, and he says, uncensored Twitter has changed the world. Balaji goes on to say, now that things have stabilized, the full impact of speech and thought control is made obvious by their absence. I'd say that's totally true. I've noticed that the ability that we all have to talk about things that we just absolutely couldn't talk about before Twitter was this pressure valve, and we're able to have adult conversations again about all these things that are real threats to the world, right? Really, really dangerous things like what's going on with COVID and what's going on with censorship around talking about COVID, and what's going on with institutions like the Federal Reserve, and how many conversations are possible outside of that without the usual, oh, you don't understand, you're not in the loop, right? Remember what I always describe in the summer of 2019 when Bitcoiners, myself included, was doing a lot of mainstream media around the repo market. Oh, you Bitcoiners don't get it. It's technical. You don't understand, right? So that was part of the gaslighting that was going on at the time. And that's just one small example, right? This is pervasive throughout. And one of the neat things, and Balaji brings it up by mentioning this book, Private Truths, Public Lies, The Social Consequences of Preference Falsification, is really about, so the story he's talking about here is a sociological observation, let's say, a book written on why it is we tell and how it is that we can fall under the spell of a shared lie, or how we can ignore what we all know is true in order to remain ensconced in a shared lie. So what he says here is this Twitter situation, having changed the world and allowing this pressure valve, has given us all this opportunity and elbow room now to really start shaking up what is an acceptable public lie and what isn't an acceptable public lie. And the formula under that has changed a great deal. So again, I just mentioned the January 6th thing. Remember, the mainstream media is still trying to treat January 6th just straight up as an insurrection, right? Because you get control of the magic room, and therefore the largest nuclear power in the history of the world will certainly abdicate all of its power because you captured the flag, right? It's all capture the flag. So that's one of them. But the one that I've been talking about since the very start of the breakup, right? One of the things that I've been mentioning since the start of the breakup is this idea of America losing a war. Now, I don't want American people to die. I don't want any of these things to happen. But what we said and why we even named this show The Breakup is there is a certain public truth that Americans continue to um, cultivate, let's say, less and less, but one that was cultivated for generations of America as just this absolute force for good in the world, as the exporter of democracy, as the exporter of freedom. Now, everyone here in the breakup knows that we're not exactly down with that. We understand the American spirit is all those things. We definitely believe in American exceptionalism. We definitely believe that American people have a lot more to give the world and the story is not over and that there is a golden age for America just around the corner. But we do have to accept and discuss all the terrible things America has done in this cycle between World War II and now, particularly as it relates to the national security apparatus, CIA and FBI, and all of these folks over time have definitely squeezed out any credible argument that America is this pure force for good. And part of changing the world, part of what Bitcoin offers is a new way to calibrate this situation and to shed some of these old myths that we have about ourselves and embrace new ones, right? Embrace new ideas. And what Balaji is getting out here with this book, Private Truths and Public Lies, gets to that point, and I'll explain it in a second. So what he says is we're in a public preference cascade, many public lies breaking down all at once. The Overton window is shifting rapidly. Hold on. So he reads this quote here from the book, and it says, Curran says that a person's choice of a public preference depends on these three variables, and hence that people's expressed views, their public preferences, are very much a product of what they think other people think. Curran's psychology is crude and his basic intuition may appear obvious, and yet it casts light on many things, including the prospects for social stability and social change. As people's thoughts about other people's thoughts change, there is a shift in reputational incentives, and hence people's public preferences can shift. If you come to believe that there is a silent majority believing what you believe, you probably won't be silent for very long. For social change to occur, expectations are crucial, very much because they affect people's public preferences. And when people's perceptions of what other people think are shifting rapidly, there can be a bandwagon effect. These are all abstract points, but they bear on concrete events, including the fall of communism and apartheid, and more mundanely changing norms involving smoking, discrimination, sneaker wear, the use of myths, surprise bestsellers and unread bestsellers, and recycling. In all these cases, changing perceptions on other people's thoughts help create a kind of cascade from one social state to another, which is really what what we are talking about here, right? That they're, even take the the one on smoking, right? Or when the smoking one came out, it was not something that I thought could even happen. It was so pervasive in society. I didn't like it. I was working in bars at the time and I despised the smell. And I still to this day wish there would be a place for smokers to go. That's how much I said, well, we should negotiate this stuff. But once it became popular, once it caught on, let's say, and it became normal to say it out loud and to say, oh, it's so terrible in these places. It didn't take long at all. It was within a matter of months. And that absolutely was a huge lesson for me personally on how fast this stuff can shift. And now this is one of the strongest addictions in the world, right? Smoking tobacco is a hugely addictive thing. And my parents, being the hippies that they were, explained to me at a young age, stay away from tobacco. It's absolutely the worst thing you can ever get mixed up in, the most addictive. And so I, took them as credible. My dad would always say, I've tried all these things in my life. Tobacco is the worst. And it seemed credible to me. And now you get a situation where everyone's perceptions around that has changed. But it's just one, even with recycling, for example, I do the opposite. Like, I don't recycle. I refuse to recycle. I'll do the 5-cent cans because of deposits. I don't take the 5 cents. I separate them and put them out on the street for the people who are running all of these can pickup self-started businesses that you see all over the place, right? These old people who are supplementing, I would imagine, their fixed income retirement, going around picking up bags of cans. For years, I have segregated those, put them outside so that someone can come pick them up and get the nickels you get for them. If you're not from a place that does the nickel deposit, there's still, I think, a way to get some money for the aluminum. Most places that I live have the nickel deposit. So you put it outside, someone comes and gets it. It's just, a little thing. But the rest of it, I refuse. I've always refused. Plastic, not recyclable, really, right? If you know that little symbol on the bottom of your plastic containers, there's a number in the middle of the recycling icon. We can only really recycle anything up to 4 or 5, right? After that, whatever, if you see a 6 or a 7 or an 8 inside, it's not recyclable. It's not happening. People throw it all together, but it makes no sense, right? So for a long time, and I think, it was the Penn and Teller, the Penn and Teller had a show on HBO years ago that debunked all these myths, and they showed the economics behind recycling. And it was clear it didn't make sense 15 years ago, and it still doesn't make much sense. So it's one of those things that I will do just to be irreverent, and just to let's say spur the religious, right? When you say something like, I don't recycle, I don't believe in it, right? You get the kind of reaction you get to blasphemy, right? Which is why I do it. I like the blasphemy reaction. You don't recycle? You don't recycle? And I'll say, well, neither do you. I mean, you segregate your garbage. It doesn't mean you recycle, right? It's not going to be recycled. Some of it is, maybe, right? But it's not like there's this efficient system that separates all this stuff. It doesn't happen, right? You get some people who have the garbage jobs that actually do separate some of the garbage, but I mean, are we really making a difference here, right? Obviously not. So, but you still can't really say that. This hasn't really passed into the Overton window. Still a bunch of people worried about how Greta would feel about it all. That's how their decisions are made. That's why I say Greta's decisions, Greta's happiness has a large role to play in the energy policies in Europe. I'm not kidding, right? It's exactly what is going on here. It's the public lies aspect of this. And it's looking over and saying, well, what does that person think? And what does that person think? And I hope my opinion jives with them. And I hope what I say doesn't insult anyone, especially Greta, because if she gets angry, then we got a whole bunch of trouble. So how many policies over time have actually been made just based on what you think other people are thinking? And because we don't have a public space, or we haven't had a public space in order to really gauge what people think about these issues, that's where we've gotten into so much trouble, especially around energy and the environment and all of those things. So what Balaji is saying here, this whole idea of public lies and private truths, and it really just being about looking over to your neighbor, looking over to other people in your cohort. And then once you see that something that you couldn't have said out loud for a little while because it's blasphemous becomes a little more normalized, then you're going to hear way more of it, right? Which is what is happening now when it comes to energy, and when it comes to the budget, when it comes to printing money. For so long, I mean, I don't think most people had the awareness to understand and debate the Federal Reserve and the banking cartels. But Bitcoin, of course, has brought a lot of that language into the public sphere. Bitcoin, of course, has normalized a lot of these things. And when I think of these cohorts and groups, it's such an important thing that Bitcoiners have been at once so argumentative with each other, right? Because we don't self-censor. We haven't self-censored. We've been willing to dunk on heroes from the very beginning in Bitcoin. And by having a community that is willing to argue about everything, not have any of these private public lies, let's say, right? Or fewer public lies, right? The world of Bitcoiners has been private truths and public truths, right? The idea of public lies and Bitcoin have they've been there, but they've been debated so hotly that they haven't ever crystallized to become a groupthink situation where someone would just eject their normal thoughts and implant the groupthink thoughts, right? We saw that with the scaling wars back in 2017. The scaling wars were a great test that Bitcoin passed in this vein, because you had the cool kids who were saying, oh, it's okay. We can just fork Bitcoin and we're going to have the big blocks and we're going to be able to do all this consumer facing stuff. And look, Ethereum's stealing so much activity. All the developers are going over there. They're going to other chains because they're willing to break things and move fast. And it's going great. And we need them in Bitcoin. And it was a lot of those sort of social contortion arguments that were used around Bitcoin at the time, and Bitcoiners passed the test. Now, it was definitely heated, definitely angry, definitely full of anxiety at the time, right? I remember what it was like. And in some ways, people were afraid to speak their mind about the issue simply because if they had an opinion, it would gather so much attention at the time that it would become a lightning rod. Now, that didn't mean that arguments were going unsaid, right? That's the difference. Now, some people just didn't want the fight. It didn't mean they had an opinion that was influenced by what a group or another might think. So you had a situation where enough was being brought to public, where there was very few or very little private lying going on, or public lying going on, pardon me. Most people were pretty honest about what they thought. And in the end, you got a result that I think reflected that, right? The vast majority of people who were feeling anxiety about the fork thought it was too risky. That side won the fight. There was no hard fork. Bitcoin didn't have to undergo any of those risks, any of those unknowns. It was just accepted that some of these other developers would go to other places, experiment. We're seeing them come back now, which was one of the predictions made a long time ago, that we would perfect layer 2 scaling things on other chains, and then a lot of that layer 2 stuff would come to Bitcoin, which is what we're seeing, right? That's sort of what it's out there. But if you think of this piece now as what the cool kids think, and thinking about the cool kids, well, government, right, has never really been particularly cool, but when it came to prestige and credentialism, right? So I'm not talking about cool as in what do the young people think about it. That had already been, there was already that sort of schism. But everyone who was a credentialist, everyone who believed in experts, everyone who believed in the systems we created for government and policy making and enforcement and compliance and all of those things, all of them supported by those credentialist folks, particularly in Europe, right? That's the thing that's starting to crack. And if you look at what's going on with Twitter, this is what happened this weekend, right? So we hear about all this discrimination stuff, and it turns out this weekend that Twitter left the EU voluntary code of practice against discrimination. So Thierry Breton, it's this guy who was always like, we will put the bird in the cage. We will put the bird in the cage, right? This French guy. Who just seems like the biggest French credentialist know-it-all you've ever seen in your life. You got to even just see this guy's picture. It's hilarious, right? Hilarious. Soft-skinned aristocrat, right? So Twitter leaves EU voluntary code of practice against discriminations, but obligations remain. You can run, but you can't hide. This is Thierry Breton to Elon Musk. Beyond voluntary commitments, fighting disinformation will be the legal obligation under DSA. As of August 25th, our teams will be ready for enforcement, right? So they're threatening Twitter here. So remember, the first one was, if Twitter wants to be a public space, right, it can't be about the ego management of Elon Musk. Then we hear from Balaji, who's saying, well, look what it's done to the Overton window. We can talk about all these things now, and we're going to get to those in a second with the Ukraine situation and with COVID-19 and all the other information that we're starting to come to light since Elon took over. And Thierry says here, our teams are ready for enforcement. So Balaji comes in again and says, the EU is in the midst of an economic collapse due to the energy crisis and wants to muzzle their restless population. So they're rebooting the Stasi to stamp out disinformation. So talking about the disinformation that Twitter is supposedly causing, according to Thierry Breton. Any inconvenient fact on war or inflation will become disinformation, right? They want to make sure narratives like this receive no pushback from EU citizens. Richard Hanania says Twitter pulls out a voluntary agreement with EU on fighting disinformation. European Union Commissioner, you can run, but you can't hide. He says the arrogance of these people. They build nothing, contribute nothing to society, feel entitled to rule the world. And here's the interesting thing about this Overton window that is brought up in this context, right? So Balaji says this, well, Twitter is in Texas now. So if the EU tries to extort Texas companies, perhaps the Republic of Texas increases the cost of EU energy. Don't forget, we've mentioned many times here, the world has basically become a big example of a Russian energy oligopoly, right? And American energy companies are now probably the most powerful companies on planet Earth, right? Which is my path to hyper Bitcoinization, is to take those energy companies and persuade them to value and measure and reference their energy systems in terms of Bitcoin, which I think brings us to running the world and separating money and state. But that's a story for another time and another show. What we do think is that these energy companies don't necessarily have allegiance to governments. And what he's saying here is if the Texas energy companies don't want to deal with this EU stuff and are at all insulted by what's going on with their treatment of Twitter in Europe, then things might change very quickly. And Balaji has his summary of this. Truth be told, the EU cookie law alone justifies a new Operation Overlord. Only in liberating the dark continent will we liberate the world. So, as far as private lies, right, or public truths, being able to say that Europe is the dark continent is one of those Overton window questions. It is the dark continent, right? These are some of the stupidest people in the world, and Canada would love to be in that crowd of stupid people, right? That they can't wait. They wish the stupid Americans, they say in Canada, they'd rather be dumb like Europeans, right? Now, here's where things become so important when it comes to this debate around Overton window and what you can say in public and what is a private lie and a public truth and a public lie and a private truth, right? So the public lies that have been spread around for a while. Now, we don't know anything, right? Now, remember, we're going to talk about Ukraine, Russia, and COVID-19 now, right? We are not saying that these are the answers. We are not saying that we have it all figured out when it comes to COVID and where it came from and all that. That's not what I'm about to say here. What I am going to say is that we're having these conversations, and this is information that is difficult for many people to hear, listen to. It's not even in the public sphere other than on Twitter. And it's folks like War Clandestine, and you're going to see RFK Jr. talking about it in a second too. So it turns out there was a testimony in Europe, right? The very Europe that is the dark continent, the very Europe that is, as Balaji has predicted, is going to be using any form of dissent, is going to be deeming any form of war dissent, inflation dissent, dissent about COVID therapeutics and all that stuff. All that's going to be disinformation. So there was a doctor who testified at the EU just a few weeks ago, and it was his name is David Martin. And he was giving his presentation to the European Union on COVID-19. So a lot of people talking about it today because the video has come out. You've got Kim.com saying the following, right? This is the most important video you will watch this year. Millions were killed with COVID-19 for profit. And this was the big quote that's coming out of David Martin's testimony. COVID-19 was an act of biological warfare perpetrated on the human race. It was a financial heist. Nature was hijacked. Science was hijacked. RFK says, congratulations to David Martin for this elegant and persuasive summary of this crime against humanity. A lot of people coming in and thanking this David Martin fella. War Clandestine breaks it down. He says, bioweapons alert. The Russian government tweeted that they found human-engineered bioweapon samples at a U.S. Department of Defense funded biolab in Ukraine. Not a single article on any search engine, and I seem to be the only one reporting on it on Twitter. Hello. And now, remember, we're not here telling you that we know and trust the Russian information more than we trust the American. That's not what, if that's what you heard, erase it from your brain, right? I'm just saying these stories are out there. Now, I have a suspicion about what is true, but I don't know, right? I don't know. Too much misinformation, too much fog of war. But exactly in the way that Balaji is suggesting, we have to have a public forum to talk about these things, even if they're stupid. Here's even an idea that might serve you well in life in general, right? And I'll use it to continue to talk about this in a second. But when I program events, for example, right, one of the tricks that I use is to actually use bad ideas, right? Do you know one way to generate a good idea is to not be afraid of saying the bad idea out loud? Did you know that shortcut, right? Just by saying a bad idea, the contrast or whatever else it sparks in your mind might lead you to the good idea. So when I program an event, I'll often say, well, 9 out of 10 things that I do are stupid and wrong and should be criticized or spoken out against or disagreed with. But that's how you get to the one good idea that's worth saving that will finally make it to the show when you're producing it live, right? So one of the best ways to get good ideas is to not just cycle through the pretty good ideas you have until you see if one is good and better than the others. That works, right? But the best way that I've ever come across is to not be afraid of saying any idea that comes to your head, even if it's stupid. And if the idea is stupid, say it anyway, because the bad idea is a course to good ideas. It's the road to good ideas. Regularly, that's the case, right? So if you're talking about who to put in a panel, if you're talking about almost anything, right? Just put the bad idea out and you'll see the good idea through why the thing is bad, right? Once you isolate why a thing is bad, you can then more clearly see the good things that don't have those bad ideas injected in them, or has those ideas injected in them in a way that makes them more palatable or interesting or relevant, right? So I'm bringing up these arguments because they're super important. I suspect they're closer to the truth, but I don't know. I don't know, right? And if they are bad ideas, you got to get it out there. You got to be able to say the bad ideas in order to fully debunk them, right? So here's what he's saying. So he's saying that there's Department of Defense biological weapons that are there, right? This is the Russian government saying it, right? The Russian government are coming out and saying that the Russian military shows evidence of the U.S. Department of Defense funding for the studying of bird migration at various biolabs and veterinary labs in Ukraine, alleging the U.S. have contingencies to use bird migration to spread highly lethal human-engineered pathogens from Ukraine. The U.S. military is actively studying these economically significant infections outside the national territory in biolaboratories located along the borders of its geopolitical adversaries, right? So this is something that other countries have been saying for a long time, that America has been doing this. It's a major problem and that they got to stop, right? So this David Martin guy was saying that this is something that happened and is the reason why we were in this pandemic. Simon Atiba, who is a White House correspondent, says the following: the mainstream media refused to publish this, but I did, and it's going viral around the world. Dr. David Martin shows COVID-19 pandemic was premeditated domestic terrorism, first isolated in 1965, more than 50 years ago. Dr. David Martin, addressing the European Parliament at the International COVID Summit, made a startling assertion that the COVID-19 pandemic, responsible for millions of deaths worldwide between 2020 and 2023, was a premeditated act of domestic terrorism. So look, the Nordic Times also picking the story up now about what happened and how authorities and how authorities and drug manufacturers perpetuated this. You have a few more stories. This again coming from the Standard in the UK. US intentionally released COVID virus in Wuhan, EU summit told. And this is David Martin's testimony. The purpose of the coronavirus release was to boost acceptance of universal vaccination is what he's saying, right? So now, again, we don't know. We don't know the truth, right? But when you're talking about the Overton window getting ideas out there, saying things, having a public square to say them in, that's the most important thing. And what we've been saying here for America and its perception of itself, and again, this idea of a public lie that America is this great peacemaker, it's out there doing all the good things, they're the good guys, right? We're the good guys. That's something that I've said for a long time now must change. Now, it doesn't mean Americans have to accept some bullshit idea of their national consciousness, of their future, of their potential, of what they really want to be and aspire to. It's the same as a good idea and a bad idea being used as contrast to get to the good idea, right? It's the same as when we talk about Jungian psychoanalysis. America has to deal with its shadow. It can't keep suppressing the truth about some of the stuff that it does. It's got to work it into its ego. It's got to be able to work it into its national identity. And in so doing, it can actually protect itself from these bad shadow forces working their way into the system even more, creating more rot, creating more rancor, creating more anxiety and more trouble and more suppressed negative, terrible thoughts, actions, activities, all those kinds of things. We're finally getting there, right? We're finally getting to the point where Americans are able, even the most patriotic Americans, the ones who love their country the most and want to see their country be everything they hope and believe and pray it could be, right? Even those Americans are waking up to some of the terrible things that America has done, which I think is a necessary and natural process in order to get over this stuff. And so we're finally at the point where we're able to have a conversation about America being at the source of COVID, right? We heard for a long time, oh, it was the Chinese. You had even Trump calling it the China virus, right? I don't know if Trump was right about that. It sounds like Trump had it 100% wrong, right? China virus, what? The Chinese have been saying we did it, right? Now, I laughed at first a couple of years ago when I heard China was blaming America for COVID in 2020. Now, after all that I've seen, it at least looks more credible, right? Now, again, we don't know. Don't know. Fog of war. If it turns out it really was created by China, I won't be surprised, right? But nor would I be surprised if we have a smoking gun proof that the United States and actors within the United States system created this and did exactly as David Martin said. I would not be surprised. And that's the big change, right? I'd have been surprised about that. Just 3 years ago, I would have been completely surprised. I would have said, no way is America that corrupted that it's possible that they would release a pathogen in order to sell a vaccine. I would never have believed that, right? But now, if you put everything together, the voting changes, the Zelensky, the perfect phone call to Ukraine, the impeachment, the first impeachment of Trump, the second impeachment of Trump, how they're related to COVID, well, it's a crazy story, but we can talk about it now. And who knows? Who knows? The point is, we get here around together in the morning, each of us now able to talk about these things more openly, not really ashamed and worried about what people are going to say about us. Oh, what are they going to say about us Bitcoiners who didn't want to get vaccinated and who thought the whole thing was a scam? Well, right, we're feeling pretty good. I'd say we're spreading our point of view, and in so many ways, our point of view is becoming the pervasive standard point of view that more and more people are accessing. So there you go. The ability of Americans to both be affected by this cascade of change and public perception and seeing that your neighbor is changing their mind, seeing that your neighbor is changing their mind. And it's touching other issues, right? The mismanagement of the war, for example. I don't know if you guys saw this weekend, but AOC, this was someone who would have been, for a long time, would have been lionized as an anti-war hero and all this stuff. But now, with what's going on with the debt ceiling and voting for more weapons to Ukraine, she's being forced to deal with parts of her constituency that hate this. So she got heckled the other day, right? So she was shouted down in a New York City town hall with some people calling her a piece of shit, right? Because of the war thing. There are groups of Democrats that are anti-war and Republicans that are anti-war through and through. They will not accept it, right? So you're getting this game now of people at this meeting looking around saying, maybe she's not that cool. Maybe she's not that cool. Maybe she's in the same boat as Greta and we don't have to care too much about what her feelings are and how she thinks about us, and we can criticize her. And so it happened this weekend. You get all kinds of people just yelling and screaming and hating on her. So you have that. You've got, what's going on in Europe now. The government is going to be putting in price caps, right, for milk and bread and all this stuff because of the rising cost of living. Well, how much longer is that going to last? Right? Like this is another one of those things that just creates a situation where criticizing the government for this stuff and mismanagement goes right to the most elemental aspects of our everyday life. There's going to be people criticizing government involvement and everything. And this is that saturation of government in our daily lives that is starting to push people out of expecting government to solve their problems, right? The extreme case we had once in Canada, I'll never forget it, when we had the flooding in native reserves, particularly the Cree reserves in the north in Canada. And the CBC, which is the state broadcaster in Canada, would bring these old people and they would show the beds in their houses full of mold, and they'd say, the government, this is the government's fault. And they ran with those stories as if it was the government's fault that their bed wasn't made. I mean, really, and their bed wasn't clean, right? And so at the time, 10 years ago or a little bit longer, that didn't get much pushback. Now you have a situation where more and more people are like, well, why can't you clean your bed? I mean, maybe the government needs to give you some money to get a new bed, but you got to clean your bed, right? And so the ability and the Overton window here for talking about public lies and private truths and all of that is indeed changing because we have this public sphere, and it's only going to change more. Things like that. What about with Greta in Europe and the energy situation now? Well, the countries that stayed with nuclear, right? The countries that stayed with nuclear, Finland, Norway, Sweden, this weekend, all weekend long, electricity has been free, free. So electricity prices in the Nordics continue to stay negative. Bitcoin miners in Finland and northern parts of Norway and Sweden keep being paid to consume electricity. And that's because of all these new nuclear reactors. So these are groups that didn't listen to the hype and what we've said for a long time, Putin probably funding the European disinformation campaigns against nuclear energy for a long time, saying, no, you're going to be great, guys. Go with the wind. The wind is beautiful, beautiful European wind. You're going to be great. Don't worry about it, right? Most of that paid for by Russian disinformation. The sun. They don't even get sun in Europe. They're going with solar energy. Have you ever seen sun maps of Europe? I mean, the where I live in Vermont, the most northern part of America gets more sun than almost all of Eastern Europe. It's not even close. You only get sun in like Italy, France, and Spain, and the rest of it is just dark, right? And so they're going to go with solar in Germany. This was a Russian disinformation campaign, right? It was clear. And so the Scandinavian countries that didn't buy it and kept going on their own with nuclear energy now have so much energy that they have to pay people to use it this weekend. And the Bitcoin miners loving their life. So again, this is another one of those cases where had you listened to experts, had you listened to the systems put in place in Europe with credentialism and the know-it-alls and the Thierry Bretons that are threatening Twitter and Elon Musk about you can run, but you can't hide, this whole power structure that's been there for 80 years now, led most of the continent into its current poverty. And the Scandinavian places, Sweden never locked down, right? And then they got free energy. So you get these amazing changes that are happening right in front of our eyes when it comes to energy, when it comes to being able to talk about these things. And it's going to continue to lead to a situation where people aren't expecting government to be able to provide these problems, solutions to these problems anymore. And the debt ceiling debate in America is a perfect example of it, right? So the last story, the one that we're going to cover today, is this debt ceiling story. So, what did I say to you all at the beginning of the debt ceiling thing? Boring, always boring. Of course, they're going to come up with a deal. The deal they came up with might end anyway, right? It might not fully make it, but here's what you get in the deal, right? So, first of all, good news for Bitcoiners. It looks like the 30% tax on mining dead, right? It looks like that got wiped out in the negotiations, which I think is a awesome thing. Now, the unintended consequences of the 30% tax would have forced more decentralized mining and home mining, which could have been a good thing. But glad that the mining companies themselves aren't going to have to feel the trouble. So it looks like they're going to try and cap defense spending, or sorry, no, non-defense spending. Defense spending remains uncapped. The debt ceiling is removed until after the election, so they're not going to have to fight about it again before the election. The IRS thing, remember they said they were going to get the $80 billion to hire 80,000 new staff or some crazy number. I'm probably getting those wrong. But I remember they wanted a crazy amount of money for the IRS, and they were going to hire a crazy amount of new staff. So they get none of that for this year, none of that for next year. So under the deal, non-defense spending, the adjustments include shifting $20 billion in IRS funding to another non-defense areas and rescinding $30 billion for a COVID relief fund, I guess. So here's the Internal Revenue Service. The agreement would cancel the total fiscal year 2023 staffing funding request. So that means they're not going to be able to investigate more people this year. House Republicans determined to jettison $80 billion in IRS funding contained in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm not sure how they're going to do it all. I've heard some people say it's not a full abdication of the IRS plan. Much of the IRS plan is still there in years going forward, but as I understand, it will get renegotiated next time. So there's nothing happening from now until the next time in 2025 when this thing has to be looked at again. So the Inflation Reduction Act money that was set aside for the IRS doesn't look like it's going to go exactly as the law said. Looks like the student loan stuff is going to have to be repaid. A bunch of climate and energy stuff, but it looks like the deal is as boring as I predicted, right? I said, don't waste your time. It's like basketball, the debt ceiling thing. It's like the last minute is what counts, right? The rest of it is not important. And in general, everyone was incentivized to make a deal here. Everyone had a reason to make a deal. It was clear they were going to come up with one. So they came up with one. And, it's good for Bitcoin, I guess. The IRS was the one thing that I wanted to see reduced. Looks like we got our way more or less. Looks like they're going to have to do it again, but we're going to win. We're going to win. All right, let's see what we got in comments today. Let's see. Let me go back. Let's go back. All right, here we go. The media pushed so hard it got off. They did. I know. It did get awkward. Yeah. Bitcoin, a future you can count on. Indeed. Bitcoin Graffiti says we should re-roll the I Ching again. We will. Good idea, Bitcoin Graffiti. I'll do that tomorrow. We did many months ago at the beginning of the season, in case you guys were wondering, we did an I Ching roll about what Bitcoin is looking like. And I think we did this right around the time. Yeah, when we did it, it was right when the first SBF blow up happened, because we were, I was looking at some of the metaphysical stuff. It was hilarious. Did you know the whole Luna thing began on a full moon lunar eclipse? And the next time there was a full moon lunar eclipse was the last bit of the story. The the SBF story, that was on a full moon lunar eclipse day. So it's just this funny um, coincidence, but it got us to thinking about I Ching and all those things. So indeed, it is time for a new reading of the I Ching. Good morning, Calcasa. Hope you're doing well, man. Johnny Rico, Americans have been lied to. Our servicemen and women are having difficulty with the fact that they were fighting for elites plus oil, not freedom. Yeah, it's pretty bad, Johnny. But that's the kind of shift that Americans need. Remember what we've said here for a long time. America needs to lose World War III, right? America needs to lose World War III for Americans to win. And if now, I don't want people dying. I don't want it to be lost in the way World War II was lost by the Japanese, for example, right? I don't want to see America get nuked. Obviously, I don't want to see dead bodies, but I want to see the people understand in the same way that when America won World War II, the Americans lost, right? America Inc. won World War II. What did the Americans get? A little more consumption. That's about it, right? They got fat and ugly. Sorry, right? They did. I don't think the natural state of Americans is to be what they're looking like today. So they're going to get over it. They're going to go ahead over it. Let's fucking go to count. Yeah, man. We love it. Good morning from Ottawa. Boomer, the broken ruler. Cool, Ottawa. I might go to Ottawa, not this week, but next week. Hi, team. Good morning. Indeed. When I run into moral dilemmas, I just look at what would Greta do, Span. What would Greta do? Just saw Madeira ad today and looks beautiful. Want to go there someday. Now that I know that many businesses accept Bitcoin there. Yeah, I've never been to Madeira, but it looks absolutely stunning. I thought about going to what's the Azores near Madeira. A lot of flight, a lot of the Canadian Portuguese Day yesterday. By the way, I was in a parade with the Portugal people in Montreal. So a lot of the Portuguese in Canada, and there are a lot, all come from the Azores. So there's a lot of flights to the Azores from Canada. Debt suspended, ceiling removed. America's all about smashing those glass ceilings. Yeah, it will. America's going to get through this. It's going to be beautiful too. You can always see how much truth there is to a subject by how hard it gets censored by the propaganda media. I wish that wasn't a straight correlation, Catacombs, but it is, which is sad. Sounds about right. Say no to the Fauci ouchie. It makes you wonder about 911 and how. Yeah, well, there you go, bud. Honestly, 3 years ago, I would look at 9/11 stories as like entertainment purely, right? Well, what about Tower, whatever. Nowadays, moon landing 2, it doesn't hit the same as it used to. 9/11 in particular doesn't hit like it used to. There's something up there. I don't know what propaganda rhetoric to believe. I can only go on what my gut tells me. Yeah, that's Johnny. You're honestly your best bet in a lot of ways, right? Honestly, your best bet in a lot of ways. That's what a third eye is all about, right? Do you know that there are in your pineal gland there is an actual lens inside your brain, like an optic lens? Crazy, huh? So the third eye is a real thing, right? Nice way to bring it all together. Thank you, Rickster Swickster. Doing our best. I wish I didn't get the vaccine. Job loss was a big part of my decision. I should have quit. Yeah, a lot of people are dealing with that. But that's part of this. Now, I don't think there's a secret nanotech inside of the vaccine and all that stuff. I think it was a psychological operation. So I wouldn't worry too much about the getting it if you survived. But remember the feeling of being forced, because I think that's where this private lies and public truths and all of that stuff comes into play, right? Which is really what we're all dealing with right now. There is no second vax, but is the next bit. That's what a lot of people say. My wife worked as a respiratory therapist, front lines from the start, and they forced the vac on her too. Yeah, that's one of the worst. All these frontline people who are like, well, because I was in my backyard in New York banging my pots at 7 p.m. for these people. It wouldn't have been to make them get vaccinated, right? Not at all. Morning, CK. Morning, CK. It's horrible. I work in it now. They're pushing mRNA for other uses. Ivy League universities should question more. Yeah, there are some of the stupidest people in the world as well, right? They're academics and Canadians. Academic Canadians. Yikes. Yikes. Did anyone really tell you they were going to let themselves fall in it by not raising the ceiling? Yeah, exactly, P-Man Van. We called it. We did not waste your time with debt ceiling talk. We always said we're just gonna make fun of it before, and that's what's gonna happen. Try to make it to Ottawa meetup when you're in town. We have 2 months. Is that so? Yeah, I might just be on the weekend. It's really just to drop. I was invited to my friend's cottage with some of my, dude friends, and I might be dropping my family off. But I could do that. I'm gonna try and go. What I got to do is I got to get all the Bitcoin Magazine folks from Vermont together to make a Burlington something or other, because that looks like where we need the most work. All right, team. That's all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a great Memorial Day, everyone. Take it easy and don't get stressed out, man. We're gonna win. Peace.